You've just walked into a new gallery exhibition, and immediately you start thinking about the artist who created these amazing works in front of you. Naturally, you dream of working in the arts and what that would be like, to have an exhibit all your own. But have you ever thought about all the other ways you could also work in the arts? Put on that one exhibit, there's also a gallery, and thus a gallery owner, not to mention gallery employees. There's potentially a marketing company that helps the gallery spread the word on new exhibits. There might be writers that critique and share information about the new work on display in articles, whether in traditional newspapers or the many ways of this digital space. And there might have been a curator pulling all of these various pieces and people together. So when we really get to thinking about it, there are actually a lot of ways to make a living working in the arts. And as you're about to hear from this week's guest, perhaps if part of your goal in making art has been to make an impact, to raise awareness around important social issues, well, maybe making the art isn't always the fastest or the biggest or the most direct way to make that impact. Maybe it could be through curation. Obviously, you're just going to have to keep listening to find out, aren't you? Welcome back to another episode of the Maker's Playbook Podcast, the show where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. But before we get ahead of ourselves, a friendly reminder that the Maker's Playbook Podcast is currently being sponsored by Amico. You may have noticed that Amico isn't taking direct orders on their website currently. And while that may seem like a bad thing, the reason for it is awesome. For the past 8 months, Amico has been focusing on supplying their distributors first. In other words, they're focused on making sure your favorite local shops are supported before even their own website. And you can easily pick up your favorite glazes like Potter's Choice Honey Flux or Rainforest Celadon on the shelf of your local clay shop and avoid those extra shipping costs in the process. Naturally, high demand and supply issues have made it hard to keep stores stocked these days. But Amico is dedicated to supporting your favorite small businesses first, now, and in the future. And that, my friends, is putting your money where your values are, which you know I'm all about. If you don't yet have a favorite local shop, you can find an Amico distributor near you by visiting amico.com/dealers. All right, now let's dig in to this week's episode. I'm your host, seasoned entrepreneur of 12 years, Rebecca Ikes-Cara. Hi, Angelik. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Excited to be here today.
Before we get ahead of ourselves, I know you in part because of podcasting. I mean, really, because of podcasting. Not in part. That's totally. So tell everybody who you are and let's pitch that show straight from the beginning also, because I want to spread the love.
Okay. Thank you so much. So my name is Angelik Vizcarrondo-Laboy. If you don't know already, if you didn't click because you already knew my name, I have a podcast. It's called Clay and Color. I co-hosted with my friend and colleague, Alex Anderson, who's an artist. We're both based in LA, but my background is as a curator and writer. And it's through the Brickyard Network, which is part of the Archie Bray. And it's just a bunch of podcasts. I feel like they're all very nerdy in the sense that they have to do with ceramics. But yeah, we're all ceramics lovers. And ours specifically is about artists of color working in clay, and something that I like. Well, the first 2 seasons, I don't know if the next seasons will cover this, but so far have been on the aesthetics of optimism, which is this thing that I kind of coined, and its cuteness and humor and the decorative and how that can be used to address a bunch of things, sociopolitical issues.
Things with a capital T.
Things.
Things. I love it. I love it. Were you always in curation and ceramics has just been this little network you've gotten pulled into, or was ceramics your thing and then you got into curation, or what's the Angelik story?
So I guess ceramics came first, actually. I actually went to school with the intention of becoming, I guess, a scientist. This the general term for it. Yeah, I was studying biotechnology. And I know.
I'm really glad I asked this question.
Was like really into genetics for a while, like Punnett squares, like that shit's dope. Biology was one of my favorite classes in high school. And then I started looking into stem cell research and things like that. I was like, oh yeah, the future sounds cool. But then I got to college and I was like, I actually hate this. Like, oh my God. And at some point I pushed through it. Like I was almost at my junior year by the time I decided to switch majors because, my parents had a lot of pressure on me too, that I had to do a career that made a lot of money and shit like that. And but I was just like, I hate labs. Like, oh my God, I hate labs. And I can't imagine being in a lab.
You're a science major and I hate labs.
No, like, it's like, well, the more I spend time in labs, I was just like, yeah, no, this is a nightmare. And I had kind of randomly signed up for an art history class in my freshman year. And at first, I didn't know what it was. I walked in there and I took my first quiz and got a C. And I've always been a straight A student. I was like, oh my God, like, but then I understood what it was, like how it worked. And then from then on, I got A's. And I was like, oh no, I love this thing actually. This is great. And so it became my minor. So when it came time to finally let go of the major that I had, it was like, well, okay, I guess my minor can become my major. And so I was just doing art history. With that came a requirement to actually take an art class. So I had to take a 2D class, which was perceptual drawing, which is a nightmare. It's hard. It's hard work, that perceptual drawing class. And then it was the 3D class, which I could do sculpture or ceramics. And sculpture, I don't like power tools. So that it wasn't going to be that. And so I was like, okay, ceramics it is. So I took my 101 ceramics class and freaking loved it. And at the same time, I was taking a survey of decorative arts. And in that class, it was things like a tea set and all the things that a tea set could tell you about a person or a culture. And I was like, yep, this is it. This is what I want to do. I want to tell people why these tea sets are so important. And then from then on, it was like, okay, I don't want to be in academics. So going into curatorial work is what makes sense. As much as I love research, and I still do, it give me the opportunity to be more creative and actually have like hands-on as opposed to a more like sort of passive, constantly researching role or teaching. I like to teach it, but I don't think I could do it all the time.
Which is important to know for teaching. There's a theme coming up when academia becomes a subject as I interview people on the podcast to where they're like, it's almost like it's the thing that's always in all of our heads because we're taught that that's the like safe, reliable way to be an artist. But like in reality, the number of people who should be doing it versus the number of people that are doing it are maybe not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
the
I always
same.
question what my level of patience would be with students mainly. And I also have to think about, like I said, I was a straight A student for most of my student career. And so I had very high standards for myself. And I don't know how flexible I'd be. I might be like this evil dragon lady teacher. I don't know. So, but I haven't yet to really test it out.
Well, I just love the way that you just framed the importance of curation because in my brain, I've only ever thought about curation in the sense of either a museum or a gallery. And in the sense of like the canon as it exists, right? Like, so a museum in the very historical sense of like, okay, we have this Van Gogh piece on loan for the next 6 months. Let me curate a show around it. So everything has to go with the thing everybody already knows because, also by nature of a museum, they have to get enough feet through the door to pay for all of the things.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like it's like whatevs. Whereas what you're framing is like the thing I needed to hear about art, right? Because I think a lot of us struggle with the importance of art amidst a world that is literally on fire and how we can like sync up this passion of ours with actually making meaningful change in the world. And you're literally the person who's like, yes, this is important. Let me show you how.
Yeah. And I have to say that as there's a lot of art out there that I can say I like it for the sake of the aesthetic. Like, that's a really dope looking piece. Those exist,
Mm.
and there's nothing wrong with that. However, I am naturally drawn to the things that actually have a narrative and a story behind them. So, like, it's for me, it's not just about the style. What's a style over substance? Like, I can't totally do that. As much as I am drawn to aesthetics and I like things to look a certain way, there also has to be that meaningfulness behind it. It can't just be a shallow piece. For the most part, for what I've been doing, I think there's also room for exhibitions that are just about the style over the substance, but I prefer to have a balance of both things.
Well, and you just went out on your own with curation, right? Like has it been a year?
No, it's like almost though. I guess we're at 10 months, almost 11 now. Yeah, it's hard. I'll say that.
Amen. We should have had cocktails for this phone call. I mean, we're not done. We still can. We can just pause. We can go get a drink and come back. Well, explain to people how it works to be a
Sure.
curator, frankly, because I don't know that many people know. I don't.
Sure. I'd say it's a hard answer, and it's also maybe a convoluted answer in that I don't think there's one way to be a curator. There's many ways to go about it. And I'll say, when I went to grad school, I didn't go to a program that focused on curating. Those exist now, or they have been around. I just visited a program that's been going on for like 11 years. So they've been around, but that's not what I chose to do. I was interested in decorative art. So I decided to sort of stay in the art history route and focus more on the thing rather than the methodology. And also, my thought was like, oh, well, this way I also have many different routes that I could take. Like, I could have gone and worked for an auction house or gone to a research institute or stayed in academia, things like that. But anyway, there's really so many ways that you could approach it. And I think most people do it very differently. And I think that's also why it's hard to teach. There's a little bit of I don't know, like you have to just feel it in and get creative and go with your gut a lot of the time. But for me, it just depends on what kind of a project it is. Right now, I have a lot of ideas and not necessarily a place to put them, a physical space to put them. But sometimes it starts with a word. Sometimes it starts with, I read this thing and I'm like, well, that would be really cool to be translated into an exhibition. Sometimes I just start seeing sort of connections between artists and I'm like, how do we put them together? How does it make sense to put them together? I have a lot of different sort of approaches to how I come to a show. Sometimes somebody comes to you and it's like, look, we have this space, we have this thing. We just need you to put a show together on this thing, on this topic.
On
So
this topic. Yeah.
yeah. So sometimes you don't even have that. Sometimes it's fully from scratch. Sometimes it's assigned to you. If you work in an institution, there's a lot of assignment that is just like, oh, we're doing a show on this and here you go, figure it out. So, but I also see curating as a puzzle. It's a lot of puzzling together, whether it's the aesthetics of something, puzzling like, oh, we need to figure out how to get all these pieces to this place, or how to make all the stories that the different artists and pieces are trying to say and bring it together and make it into a holistic picture for the visitor. Because ultimately, curating is really about telling a story. Like, you're trying to tell a story through artist's work. That's what you're trying to do.
Well, and it's such a huge responsibility in my perspective of like, which work you decide to put next to each other informs the visitor's experience of that work, right? I'm not going to think of any good examples, but even just the physicality of a work, right? Like a small scale piece next to a large scale piece, or a muted palette next to a more saturated palette. What you're then going to think of the work is going to be influenced by the work that's next to it, or even where it is in the room, right? Like, is that painting, when you walk through a doorway, is it, on the wall that's a part of the doorway, so you have to make like a hard turn and you miss it? Or is it the thing you see as soon as you walk in because it's in the center of the room?
All those things. Yeah, it's a lot about attention to detail or just caring about the details. And honestly, a lot of the things that happen sometimes in shows, I can guarantee that the curator wasn't fully aware that it was happening. But sometimes some really exciting things happen just by going through the process of doing the thing, of putting the things together and deciding, oh, this is going to go here and that's going to go there. But like I said, it's a puzzle, and the design has so much to do with how you end up delivering that story. It's what you were saying, that placement of this thing next to that thing, and the kind of connections that guests or the audience is going to be able to make. But at the same time, I feel like you still want to leave some things up to the audience. Like, you still want them to have a sense of discovery and curiosity while they're going through it. I feel like you don't want to just be fully like, boom, like, you still want, as much as you can very carefully say, this pair says this thing, that's great. But hopefully that pair and something else that maybe completely across the room will be able to also say something. It's all about making the big connections and like tiny connections, just like synapses firing all over the place. That's kind of, I feel like that's what you ideally want when you're curating a show.
You want people to still have critical thought.
Yes, not just curating. I think at some point, the word curating became like this like buzzword, and everybody was a curator of everything. And it's like,
Oh, girl, I've seen it in events. And I'm like, you're producing someone's wedding. I mean, I understand how that's curation in a way, but like,
and it is, there is. It's just sometimes it's like, okay, you're just using this word because it's a big word at this point. But there's people that, you know, specifically have dedicated their lives to doing this in I guess, the traditional term or the traditional use of the word. But yeah, you can curate other things. You can curate your persona. You can curate your Instagram. You can curate all these things. But again, ultimately, it's like, what connections are you making, and how, and are people able to also make those connections? Like, you could come up with something that you feel like it's the most brilliant connection in the world, but if other people aren't going to understand it, then it doesn't matter. You failed. You failed, because
Yeah.
point is, it's like you have to make the connections and also serve as a translator for the people that come and engage with that work.
Ooh, hold on, marking that clip. There's our quote. All right. Well, and pragmatically, just kind of coming back a little bit, because I'm gonna totally get carried away on the viewer and the visitor and the work, all of the things. So I'm gonna stay in my pragmatic lane here, because I feel like this is your, people can, if you want to dig more into that, then they need to pause this episode and go follow Clay and Color and dig there. But what I'm hearing pragmatically, as far as you now as an independent curator, is that, correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes you are going to spaces and pitching an exhibition that you have an idea for, and other times spaces, and by spaces, I don't know if that's just galleries or if that's, you know, empty, open space, you know, whatever spaces are, and you can shed some light on that maybe. So sometimes they're coming to you and sometimes you're going to them.
Yeah.
And they're saying, hey, we want a show, or hey, we have a very specific idea and we need you to produce it, or everything in between.
Yeah. And it's all that. I feel like the independent gig really takes a lot of hustle that I honestly need to do more of. I've been pretty preoccupied with sort of some long-standing projects that have made it a little hard to get on my proposal game. But I'm basically working on this dying spreadsheet with like all these ideas that I then plan on like transferring to documents that I can just kind of send into the world, and hopefully somebody will bite and allow me the space to share some of those ideas. But yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, with who I am, and like people have become really kind of interested in just me as a curator that specializes in ceramics. So I've done a lot of those shows. But yeah, sometimes they're just like, there's usually some kind of criteria when people come to you. It could be like, oh, you get to invite 5 artists, but the rest are going to be from an open call. It can be whatever idea you want. You will write everything, your title, but you don't get the freedom to pick all the artists. There's a certain limitation in how you pick the artists. Sometimes it's like, we already have a title and we just need you to make sense of it. And it's like, okay, sure. So once it's
That sounds like the hardest one.
it can be. And then there's also we have a very sort of basic idea. Let's say we want people from the Caribbean. This is a random example, but we want all the artists have to be from the Caribbean, but then the rest is kind of open. But there tends to be a criteria. Usually people come to you. If you come to them, then you're the one with the idea in the first place. And there might be some compromises, but probably more open as to what you can do.
Well, and I would imagine your success rate, if you're the one going to them, it's also a matter of pitching your idea within the context of what their space is about, their aesthetics that you've seen them produce before, or their brand, if you will.
And everybody needs to keep that in mind with anything, like artists, when they apply to an open call, when they reach out to a curator to do a studio visit, for example. Yeah, you have to, when you're pitching to write something to a magazine or a journal or anything, you do have to pitch things within a context. Make sure that people know that, like, you know who you're talking to, you know, that it's not this like blanket statement that you're sending everybody. It's like, no, like I read your publication, or yes, I visited your institution. And because of this and that, I think what I'm proposing makes sense.
Yeah. I'm laughing silently on this side because it's one of those things that I think sometimes when we get out of traditional employment, we think that we're never going to have to do some of these things again, right? It's like when you send off a cover letter to try and get a job and it's to whom it may concern instead of doing the work to find the HR hiring manager's first name on the website and listing their actual name, or forgetting to change that name. And then I get an email from someone that's like, "Dear Bill, we think our retouching services will be great for you." And I'm like, well,
right. That's right. No, and you know, and I'll say cover letters are rough. They're probably one of the most things to do in the entire world. But like, yeah, when you're working independently in any way, and like most artists are working independently, it is like an unending series of these kinds of cover letters in different forms. So it's painful, but necessary, I guess.
Well, I guess, is there really another way or a more meaningful way maybe for people to be able to connect with you, curators, and or spaces that they're trying to get into, right? Because that's the hard thing about cover letters, is that, at least for me mentally, it feels like you're just like throwing yourself on a pile.
Sure. Yeah. And usually that is the case. I always say this, and it's really about who you know in the art world. It's like, I guess sometimes, sorry to say, it really is about who you know, because most jobs, so many people apply to it that unless somebody you know knows the person that works there, that's going to say, oh no, you should really like pay attention to this person. It's not going to happen. You probably won't even hear back. Trust me, it's happened. So yeah, a lot of the time I'm pretty open to like cold emails. And a lot of the gigs I just get a random email and people are like, but with like studio visits, for example, you know, you can send me an email, you can send me a DM. I just feel like, don't feel entitled that you are going to get a studio visit by just emailing. But usually I feel like most curators, or I mean, it's all a personality thing. But if most curators, if you're like, hey, I like your work and I think my work fits with the kind of things that you do, would love it if you had some time to have a studio visit. You know, we're in the life of Zoom, so it can be as simple as that if you're not physically in the same location. And I think most people, most curators will say, yeah, if I have the time, I will totally do it. Like, sure, it might not be an hour long, but at least 30 minutes, and they'll take the time to meet with you. And at the end of the day, those things could really matter. Because, I mean, I think I have like an archive in my mind and like in my phone and my notes and stuff that I keep of like, well, you know, I had the studio visit once with that artist that did that one thing. And then I'm working on the show. And it's like, yeah, that work would fit for this. And I think open calls are a good way. Honestly, open calls and residencies, I've done a lot of jurying of open calls, residencies. And sometimes the person might not get their residency. Usually when you're doing that, you actually don't get to decide who gets the residency. You just kind of pick your top people that you would consider for the residency. But you take notes and you're like, I really like this person's work. Or you go and follow them on Instagram. So it's like the more you can get in basically in front of people's eyeballs, that's going to be the best. So it's like, it's about who you know. And if you are able to make in real life connections, whether you meet somebody at an exhibition opening because they came to a studio visit through other friends in the art world, it really could be kind of key to get anything, to get whatever, a grant, a prize, an exhibition, any of those things. Like you don't know, but it probably won't happen unless you know someone. Unless, I mean, some people do it just because their work is like insanely good, but it's usually a combination of your work being good and what you're trying to do is good. But then also you've done kind of the networking necessary. And I know networking is hard. It's definitely not easy for me, but I just know I have to do it.
I love hearing that because I feel like I'm always the like bearer of bad news to people who want to be independent artists, to be like, yeah, half your time maybe. I'm saying half as a rough average, but just as also a dramatic, like a really big chunk of your time
Mhm.
is going to be spent on doing things that aren't the actual act of making your craft.
Completely.
And I just don't see another solution outside of that. I
That-
mean,
I don't think there is. It is what it is in that sense that it's like you have to talk to people.
well, and I think the only solution I can think of is like, yeah, you can go get an agent. You can go get a manager who's then going to pimp you, who it's going to be their job to network and do all of those things. And maybe they have a network already. And so you're tapping into an existing thing, but you're going to pay for that.
I get, yeah, okay, there is that aspect. But I'm thinking of like having a gallery. The gallery won't find you unless you're out there. Like it's, what? You're hiding under a rock, not coming out and socializing. And no, like they're not going to find you. You need to be out there in order for people to find you. And then the more people find you, the more you're out there, the more people find you and the more things you'll get out there in the world.
Well, and then I imagine at a certain point, it's a little bit like a momentum thing, right? It's really hard to get going. But then as you meet people, as you gain that network, then people start referring your name to their friends. And so it's not that you get to stop networking,
Yeah.
but it becomes a little bit more of something that feeds itself rather than like from the ground up, which is the hardest part.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, for me, I'm in a new place. I don't know that I found my footing quite yet here, but I feel like,
Here being LA, just like
yeah,
geographically
LA,
speaking.
yeah. Right. Because I was in New York. Most of my friends are in New York. Like that's where most of my art world connections are. So I'm like slowly trying to build them in LA. So yeah, I think it can happen at all points of your career and it can be challenging and it kind of feels terrible, but you just have to keep pushing. It depends on your goals. But if your goal is to be actively producing work and being supported in that work, then yeah, you have to be actively trying to make connections with humans.
And I can hear somebody saying, like, well, I make functional work. And my goal is not to be in galleries. I
Yeah.
don't care if I'm ever. But I think so. I can hear somebody saying, okay, well, that only applies to art with a capital A, right? Like fine art, whatever, however we want to define all that.
Sure.
That's a whole different conversation. But I don't think that's like I can just hear somebody listening saying that. And I think the case is still true, even if you want to be the person that sits down and makes 100 mugs every single day and does production work.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you're trying to do with that. I mean, that another thing comes into that. It's like, oh my God, you have to have an amazing Instagram, which is, I keep telling artists that it's like, please have an Instagram. Like, give us information, tell us who you are, show us your work. But yeah, if you're making production work, which I follow tons of artists that are making production work, especially coming from ceramics. It's so hot right now to have these crazy sales of ceramics that just are selling out, and I'm so happy for them. But like if they didn't have that presence on Instagram, then it probably people wouldn't care as much. People wouldn't be buying these things to sell out. And ultimately, I don't know, is it sustainable to just stay on the Instagram sale platform? I don't know enough about that business to know, but I'm sure it's also exciting to still get, even if you're making production work, to get written up about, to do partnerships and collaborations with bigger brands or bigger platforms. So that still requires like putting yourself out there somehow and making connections too in a different way. But I still think that those human connections ultimately matter a lot, no matter what kind of path you have.
100%. I'm like, that's it. That's the end. I said an hour, but like, that's the mic drop point. Like, I don't have a segue from that. Well, let's give everybody kind of like real world life for Angelique. I don't even know if you have a typical week. Maybe it's a difference in your cycles of work as far as what that looks
Yeah.
like in terms of typical life, but not time specific. Because I'm sure it's a lot different when you are in research mode versus when you are like producing an exhibition.
Absolutely. And yeah, and that's another thing, that there's just so many levels and layers to what the curatorial process looks like. I'd say, for example, the summer, I was pretty like much here in the same spot that I'm in, just writing, because I'm working on a catalog for a show. And I was just like kind of blinders on, trying to get all this writing done. And I'm still working on that catalog. So a lot of my time for the past few months has been like, in a typical day, I'll probably be editing something or trying to find a bunch of images, or, trying to get things to the publisher. So I've been doing that a lot. There's also, at some point, I'll be installing this show. So for 2, almost 3 weeks, I'll just be on site every day, just kind of going around and picking placement and saying, yeah, that looks good or that doesn't look good. I have meetings about the design of this show. I have meetings with the store and what merch will sell regarding this show. I have meetings with the PR department, like, how are we promoting this thing? So that's one way. There's also like, I get commissioned to write things. So it's like, I might just be writing for that. And then there's the research aspect of that, which sometimes it just means there's a bunch of books around me. Like right now, there's a bunch of books on the floor, but sometimes it means like I'm physically going somewhere to do research. So there's a lot of travel involved in my job. And that could mean I'm going to go visit a school and meet with a bunch of students and have a bunch of studio visits with them or give a lecture. What else? I don't know. I feel like there's so much. Like I said, a lot of jurying. So that could mean like that I'm just sitting on my computer ranking things. And then at some point I have a meeting and we discuss why we gave people certain scores. But yeah, there's a lot of that. But I think there's also a lot of like, I might just be sitting and like scrolling on my phone, like looking through Instagram and like seeing what's out there, or going to see shows. Going to see shows is a huge part of what a curator does, because you have to see what's out there and, see like, oh, I like this, or I don't like this, or, discovering new work, like, ooh, didn't know this artist. And now I get to add this artist to like my roster. So it's kind of endless that way. It could be a lot of reading. There's a lot of reading, depending on whatever you're working on. And then hopefully there's also some time in there to try and rest. I feel like I don't rest enough, but hopefully there is, because creative, really, we should be better about resting, in the sense that like, if we're not resting, then we really can't recharge in order to be creative. So it's a
I
lot.
nod. I nod along and hear that, and I'm like, yep, I know. I
And
know it's
and you're
true.
so
Like
like, sleep, because I won't do it either.
like it, like intellectually, I know it to be true, but physically,
I know.
I have not actually
Why?
implemented it into my life.
I also feel like it's like our brains don't quite shut off ever. Like I feel like I'm having ideas and thoughts about shows and writing like at all times. I'm taking a shower and then a thought comes on, or like I just woke up and there's something, or like while I'm freaking sleeping, I'm like, I know that I'm dreaming every day. Like I don't ever go to sleep and I wake up and I'm like, I feel so rested. I'm always like having these like crazy movies happening in my mind as I'm sleeping. So I feel like it's like I can never get rest, actually, no matter how hard I try. Just like my brain's always like, let's go.
Which is like, on the positive side, is a sign of kind of like when we're doing things we're passionate about, when we're doing things we love, like you enjoy it.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that it's not work, and it doesn't mean that you don't need rest. But it's kind of harder to shut off, at least for me. This is my story, is like, it's harder to shut off because you do actually want to keep doing it in a certain way.
Yeah, and I just, it's hard to sometimes be disciplined in the like 9 to 5 thing. It's like, no, things gonna come when they come. Inspiration for writing comes when it decides to show up, So it's hard to do that. Just our brains and the processes are different than other people who maybe have work that they can leave in the office. I think it's very hard for creative people to do that. I think it's almost impossible to say, okay, I'm done for the day. It's like, no, because an idea can come from anywhere and at any time.
I'm sitting here also like totally amazed, but I'm enamored and amazed by thinking about the different skill sets that you have to have, because I know what it takes to produce an event,
Yeah.
which is what I liken to an exhibition.
Yeah.
And that is a skill set unto itself. And then I place into a different category, and maybe these are not accurate or fair categories, but like the writing and the research and that bit of it, and even the like the jurying and the writing and the research, I can kind of lump all of those together.
Sure.
And that's what I think about in like a historical curation sense.
Okay. Yeah.
But then when I think about the on-site aspect of it, my brain goes into event professional mode, and I'm like, that's a whole nother thing. Like, how, pragmatically speaking,
Mhm.
how do you get paid? Because being on site, I know, and I'm not saying numbers, but I just mean being on site for 3 weeks, or let's even say 2 weeks, maybe
Yeah.
it's a short
Yeah.
install, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes.
Yeah.
If you're away from home, because I know I've seen you do shows in Florida, I've seen you do shows on the East Coast, there's some hard costs to the fact that you are leaving your home for 2 weeks to
Yeah.
install something. That's a big deal,
Yeah.
is what I'm getting at.
My cat and partner don't love it. But I'll say this. Hopefully you are working somewhere where you will have support to do certain things. I mean, I think the main things that a curator should be doing is the research, the writing, the checklist. So coming up with what that checklist is. And then sort of after that, it's more of a conversation with everybody else. What happens at every other aspect? Design, hopefully you have a design person who's going to help you. It's usually a collaboration between the curator and the designer. I want these things here. What can that look like? So there's that. And then there's like, hopefully there's a registrar that's going to deal with shipping, which sometimes you, like as a curator, you have to be more involved than you'd like to. And, there's these other aspects, like when it comes to install, hopefully you don't have to touch anything. And there's art handlers and, people there that are going to be the professionals who are going to care for that work. And all you have to say is like 3 inches to the right, or, it's wonderful when you get to do that. But I think it always depends on where you're doing this show. And like, are you like, there's so many like ad hoc versions of curating that maybe you're the one nailing the thing to the wall. And that's how it happens. And it's pretty awesome also when you get to do that, because you don't have to be as like precious with things or as scared that, oh my God, something's going to happen to it. And usually things happen quicker that way too. But one, yes, hopefully you have that support. And then when it comes to getting paid, usually you negotiate a fee ahead of time that includes a lot. Honestly, curating doesn't pay very well. I mean, maybe, I guess, if you're like some superstar, rock star curator with like a big name, maybe you get paid a lot. But I feel like in my career, it doesn't pay well. And so you just have to hope for the best when you're negotiating a fee ahead of time, and you're conscious that like there's this full list of all these things that are expected from you, which is a long list from like coming up with the concept and doing the research to then having that checklist. And with that checklist, it also means you're contacting a bunch of people. There's a lot of admin in curating that I think people don't realize, but it's like you're emailing back and forth with a lot of people, not just like the people that you're working with to put the show together, but the artists, their galleries, collectors. There's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of people managing that happens in curating. And then from there on, there's a lot of writing, which not all people who are curating are writers or enjoy the writing part. I understand a lot of people don't read labels, but I think it's a huge part of what curating is, because as much as I feel like there's this romantic idea that you're going to look at an artwork and you're going to know exactly what it is. And you're going to be like, yeah, so smart. Not a thing. Usually you have to read the label in order to actually understand what an artwork is. So that text needs to be there. But you just have to try to get as much money as you can up front and be conscious that you're going to have to do all these things that are in a list and a very extensive list, and sometimes even more, because somebody's got to do it. And at least the way that I am, I'm going to go above and beyond to make sure that happens. And it's to the standard that I want it to be, because my name is attached to this thing.
Yep. I know it's a really crude question, but being away for 2 or 3 weeks or traveling around to find other artists to see their work in person to make sure they fit the show. I mean, there are so many hard costs associated with that. And I hope, my intention at least, is that also sheds a little light on why galleries also have to charge what they charge, right?
Yeah.
Because for a lot of artists, there's a little chip on the shoulder about, oh, well, if I give my work to a gallery, now I lose 45% or 55% or whatever it is. And like, oh my gosh, they just sold the thing that I would have sold for, I don't know, money is all relative. So the number doesn't matter. They sold it for double or triple what I would sell it for. So now I can go and sell that work for that much money, but I'll sell it on my own. And now I'll earn more money. But this kind of comes full circle into the conversation we were having before. Now that means you have to be the one doing the networking, putting yourself out there, getting to know people, boots to pavement or whatever the archaic phrase is, to get the word out there, to get the value for someone to buy it for that much. Whereas with a gallery, like, yes, they take a cut, but they're also taking a cut because they're paying someone like you to put together this beautiful show, which brings people in for an exhibition, which gets them to see your work, et cetera, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera.
And I mean, they're also, of course, it depends. I've heard that there's some galleries that the artists actually pay for shipping. That seems weird to me, but apparently it's a thing. But some galleries pay for shipping both ways. So they're taking that cost. And of course, they have the cost of whatever rent or whatever bills they're paying for their space. And a lot of it's crazy to hear what the rents are for space, especially thinking of cities like New York, like LA, like Miami. You hear the rents and you're like, oh my God, that's a lot of money. And a lot of shows end up being a loss for the galleries. They're like happy to do them, but it's like sometimes they have to balance basically a show that they know will sell fully, and then taking a chance on a show that they're like, maybe it won't sell everything, but it's good for the program. But it's sort of like a give and take on, okay, how are we gonna make sure that the lights stay on?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's such a good point, because I'm here to be the pragmatist, right? Like, this is my space in the art world, apparently, which is just like, there's nothing wrong with the gallery then needing to make the decision of one for our souls, if you will, one for our enjoyment of art, and one to pay the light bill. And that's the world we live in currently.
Some museums think that way too. It's sometimes harder. I think when you're within an institution, it's harder to see the goal of that. But some museums do that, like in the sense that they say, okay, we'll do this one big show that we know people are going to come and see. They're going to be posting it all over their Instagram. And that can support like the weirder, quirky, smaller show that they're putting on. And they're like, that maybe it's like more obscure, but hopefully people stumble upon it when they're seeing this hyped up show. So I think, there's something to that strategy for sure.
I almost think you can apply it from a making standpoint to, like, I've spoken with a lot of makers who they have their one line of work that they can make quickly, that they can make easily. It doesn't take a lot of mental capacity. They carve out like one day a week in their studio to make all of the mugs. And that allows them to then spend 2 or 3 days in the studio doing exploratory work, doing something adventurous, doing something creative.
And I do suggest that all the time to artists, especially in ceramics. It's like, what thing can you do that's smaller that can sort of guarantee your survival while you then get to work on these larger pieces that might be a harder sell, even if they're like the coolest thing ever. I feel like there's still a lot of hesitation from collectors to buy bigger ceramics. they're like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Where do I put it? As opposed to like a painting, which is like, okay, I'll just throw it on the wall. So I think there's still that
Yep.
hesitation. So yeah, like you get to make mugs, make smaller figurines, just things that like can easily sell, and you can still get a couple $100 for it. And then hopefully, and especially if you work in this sort of like capsule or every so often launches, that makes it a little more special, then yeah, you get to survive that way and support your more experimental or your larger scale, or which might be practice, which might be what you ultimately really care about. But
Which, like, you could go down a whole world. My marketing brain is like, you could go down a world of selling mugs on Etsy and nobody knows that you have an Etsy shop because you call it 123 Ceramics.
yeah,
But your actual gallery work is, Rebecca Marie Fine Art, and nobody connects the two.
that's one way for sure. Yeah. Although I think there's something, certain names have a certain like cachet to them, I guess. So if you're like, oh yeah, I'm making a mug, then it's like, for me, for example, I don't make enough money to buy some big pieces. So sometimes I'll buy those smaller pieces and I get to say, oh, I have a piece by this artist. Yeah, it's not the huge piece, but it's by them. And like, I get to say that. And I think a lot of people enjoy being able to do that as well.
Well, and you get to one that's like for yourself, you get to say that. And then you also get to support that person who you believe in, but in a way that doesn't put you in financial distress.
Exactly. Exactly.
This is just the stuff that when I talk to somebody who gets it, it seems normal. But I feel like when you look out onto the art world, it's like somehow has become taboo or dirty in terms of, yeah, you need to sell your stuff. If this is what you want to do and this is how you want to make a living, by nature of making a living, you're not going to go down to the supermarket and be like, hey, can I trade this set of bowls for cereal and milk and oranges this week? Like, that's just not going to.
No, I mean, I guess it'd be great if we were back to a bartering system, but we're not. I think some people have the trajectory to just make their big work, their time consuming work, and they know it's going to sell and it's going to sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's amazing. And so great. So if you're at that stage, awesome, rock with it. But not everybody's at that stage. And I think, yeah, people just need to be, or like artists need to be more open that there's other ways. And then I'm seeing it. I'm seeing younger artists who, even though they have sort of gravitas and they're getting attention, they're still like, I'm going to make smaller works for the people who aren't able to pay for these bigger ones. And they still get a good amount of money. Or some of them donate the money to other places just because that's what they want to do, which is awesome too.
Yeah. It's also a little bit, I'm stepping out of my realm of knowledge, but I feel like it's a little connected to, if we want to have the arts world be more equitable and more just, then perhaps maybe a portion of that is also making collecting
More
possible,
exactly. Yeah.
more accessible.
One of the bigger issues in the art world is that the people that can afford the artwork tend to be, in the 1% or way higher means than most of the people within the art world. And so, yeah, by making these like limited edition prints or, I don't know, mugs or small sculptures, then yeah, you get to open up your collecting base. And yeah, I'm telling people get excited. I'm excited. I'm excited to have certain pieces that I have when it's like, oh, it's a speck in the career at this artist. But to me, it's really awesome that I get to have a piece by them. And that I get to say like, yeah, I've helped support those artists, even though in the tiniest way possible. But absolutely, I think especially people of color haven't been able to be as sort of robustly in collecting as other people. And so it's really cool to have access to these limited edition drops or these smaller works that, you get to take home. And that's another thing, space. Art, when you're like a serious art collector, it becomes a storage issue. So it's like,
Even when you're not serious, even when you're just a ceramist, it's like,
I know, like
how many people's cupboards are full?
I have no room at this point for anything, and I have barely anything. Like I have very few things. And at this point, it's like, where do I put them? And then I see other stuff that I want. And it's like, but what am I going to wear as a hat? What the hell am I going to do with it? So that's when another reason why the money thing comes in. It's like, well, because usually an art collector, like a quote unquote serious art collector, has a giant house or has many giant houses. Yeah, many of them, in which they get to kind of spread out their work, or they're able to pay for storage so that they can rotate their art around, or their work is traveling for shows and things like that. So then, oh, great, we get to rest this wall for a little bit. But yeah, most people, it becomes an issue with space too. It's like, where the hell am I going to put this? And you want to take your, like right now, I want to redecorate. Well, I want to move altogether. But if I'm going to stay here, I want to redecorate everything. But at this point, I'm just like frustrated that I haven't gotten a chance to truly curate the artwork that I bought. I want to create moments for them, and then to have them really appreciated when, like, for ourselves, for my partner and I, and then also for whoever comes into the house. But like, I don't really have space. It's like, where the wow between the books and the artwork, I'm like, I don't got room.
Yeah, there's not apartments in LA, at least not typically, that have breathable entryway with a
Well,
credenza
no.
and like,
Yeah, right. Like a mud room. And then I'm really grateful for, you see, I have a lot of light around me. There's a lot of windows, and I love natural light. So I'm thankful for that. But at the same time, that also means I don't have walls. So like, oh my God, where do I put anything? And I've been collecting not just ceramics. I have a lot of ceramics, but I've been collecting also like drawings and some felt works. And it's like, but where do I put it? I don't have walls. So yeah, it's like the challenge. My mom keeps saying that we need to build a second floor to fit everything in. And, the more space you have, the more you buy. So probably not a solution.
it's true. That's true. 100%. Well, and that's also like with, in terms of having artists make other pieces that are collectible and more accessible to people, it's kind of in alignment with like talking about conscious consumerism. And like, I feel like so many artists are, I'm going to stereotype the art world and just say on a whole, and I know this isn't true across the board, but on a whole, at least who I know, they're slightly more aware of social issues and just, pick an issue, any issue.
Yeah.
And so then there's this internal battle between being conscientious and trying to be good stewards of our resources and conscientious purchasing and all of these things. But then at the same time, making things that there's this like battle in our brains between we're trying to encourage people to buy things because we need to make a living. And at the same time, we're trying to be intentional about our own possessions. And so if we marry those two, maybe with figuring out a way to make our work, an aspect of our work, include something that's more accessible to people, that's easier to produce. I don't know. Maybe these things can come together instead of all of us feeling like our moral compass is at odds with our professional.
No, art is hard because art is not sustainable. Like, you can make art out of sustainable materials. There is not unsustainable the way that like the clothing industry is, for example, because you don't see people typically being like, well, I don't want this artwork anymore. Just gonna throw it in the trash. The same way they like, these pants don't fit.
Monet was nice, but we'll just toss that.
Exactly. So in a sense, the good thing about art is that typically people keep it forever and ever. So it doesn't have the same sort of, like, it doesn't occupy the same space that other industries do. But at the same time, there's in other aspects, it's really bad. Exhibitions are kind of terrible. There's a lot of construction, like building pedestals and walls and all these stuff that goes on. And although I know that museums are trying to be a lot better about sharing pedestals between them and like reusing pedestals and things like that, it's usually not that great. It ends up in the dumpster a lot of the time. So there's a lot of sustainability issues, but it's also like, well, damn, what are we supposed to do? It's something to be conscious of for sure. I try when I come into another, like an institution or how I've come into institutions this year, I have not made them build any pedestals. I've just used whatever pedestals they had, and we found what works with the pieces that we had. But for example, this show that I'm working on that opens in March, that one, it's for the most part, things are new. And the institution will attempt to reuse them in future shows, but it's not a guarantee that it will happen. And they don't have the storage to be able to hold the pieces. And a lot of museums don't have the storage, or a lot of galleries don't have the storage to keep these things. So just something for all of us to be conscious of.
Oh, there's so many things. I mean, I also am conscious of you giving of your time, and I know we're coming up on an hour, but what is something that you feel like people don't know about what you do
That's a good question. I don't know. How about
besides literally everything?
I feel like I've said most things. I don't know. I think maybe compromise. There's a lot of compromise when it comes to curating. I think curating is both privilege and unprivileged. Like there's a lot, like there's an idea that it's a very privileged role. And I think people think of curators as these like,
Gatekeepers or something?
yeah, and curating is very subjective. So we do have to be honest in that, yes, curating is subjective, but like divas, that we're divas and we're like walking around and like bossing people around and stuff like that. And it's like, that's really not the case. There is an extreme amount of compromise that goes on when it comes to curating. And that's as simple as what pieces end up being in a show, what artists end up being in a show, and then just working with institutions to sort of like the give and take of, well, I would like it to be this way, but they're like, well, that's not possible, or we can do it this way instead. There's a lot of compromise. Sometimes it's like, oh, fine, whatever. Sometimes it's a lot more painful. But yeah, there's a lot of compromise. And as glamorous as maybe it seems to be traveling around and like doing all these things, it can also be very exhausting sometimes. Well, not sometimes. I've kind of always felt since I started my career as a curator that I have a very nomadic existence. Even if I have a home base, it just feels very nomadic. So sometimes you're just like in flux. And that's also another reason why rest is so hard. It's just like at all times, you're just like physically moving. And so, yeah, compromise. And it's just exhausting. There's a lot of work and you just have to kind of split yourself in all these parts to get all these things done. And it can be really challenging. But at the same time, if you love it, then at the end of the day, it's a very rewarding process to get to that point in which it's out there in the world, and hopefully getting to hear feedback from people in which they say, oh, like that meant something to me, or I was able to make a connection with that artwork, with the show overall. That's what you want to hear. Maybe you don't always hear it, but it's really great when you do.
That's amazing. Is there something, thinking about the workload that it is there something that you have experienced, artists that you know and that you've worked with and you featured, that has like made life easier, maybe to kind of either work with them or kept them top of mind, whatever?
Or when artists are prompt to emails, it's amazing. Like when they can just be like, yeah, boom, 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 here it is, you know? I don't try to make crazy requests ever, but yeah, when an artist is able to just be like, here it is. Or when they say like, I can't give you this right now, but I'll give it to you on this day. And they actually do on that day. I'm like, amazing. Like having to hunt people down, which is a lot of what curating is. You have to like nag people. It's amazing when you don't. It's amazing when you don't have to do that, when like they're just on top of it, on top of their stuff. And it also, that way, it also feels a lot more collaborative. Like you're talking, you're discussing things instead of always feeling like a last minute, like cat and mouse game.
Totally. It's funny how like the things that make people stick out in terms of networking and connecting are not, I have no polite way to put this, are not rocket science. It's not like, oh, an artist sent you a complimentary piece of, oh, this ceramicist who was hoping to connect with you sent you a mug for free and gave you all this stuff. People talk a lot about gifting and all this type of stuff. No, it was just responding to an email promptly or hitting a deadline that you said that you could make.
And I mean, it means a lot when an artist sends me like a thank you note, and those are great for sure. I love those, and I have things like that all around me. But I just think it's just like about making that process just go more smoother. Is just makes a huge difference, because also I'm the middle person. I'm a middle person always. I'm the sort of the center, like in between all these different parties. If people are prompt with things, I'm able to better satisfy these other relationships. And so, yeah, that's why it's really amazing. But absolutely, it's also great to have artists just be like, hey, thanks for including me. It's not always the case. It's sometimes you like never hear from an artist at all. And it is what it is too. But it's, again, if we are both able to just kind of be on it, then I feel like it's just better for everybody in the long run.
Totally. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I feel like the whole theme of this conversation, whether it's someone who's trying to get connected with curators and be in galleries and do that route of making their work, or whether it's someone trying to sell their work on the internet, the through line to it all, I feel like it is all about human relationships at the end of the day.
Really. That's what it is. And I'll say, like I said, Instagram is big, I feel. And like I have a lot of conversations with artists that I've like never met in person. We have conversations via DM or comments or whatever. And it's cool. It's like I can know you a little better. And then hopefully at some point we will cross paths in person. But, it puts you, and it's also like sometimes you'll make a connection and sometimes you won't. And you also have to be okay with that. I think most of my studio visits have been successful in some way, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's like we didn't connect. And I feel bad and I feel a little guilty, but then I realize it's impossible to connect with everybody. Just like a show that I do, it won't connect with everybody. There might be people that come in and they're like, what? I don't get it. And so
what is optimism? What is this? What is optimism?
What is this crap? And they just like walk out, and that's fine. But I think there's a lot of different ways to make connections, and it's important to try to make them, like to just go for it and try to make them, but also be okay when they don't work out. And I feel like that about every part of life. You might be friends with someone for 10 years, and at some point you realize it's not a thing anymore, and you move on and wish them the best, and that's it.
That's a great analogy, because I imagine that anybody listening has had a childhood friend that they like hung out with every day at school from first grade to fourth grade or something like that, and then went to junior high or went through whatever phase that like maybe nothing necessarily bad happened. It's just that you changed. You each changed. Your lives changed. And that's normal. And that's okay.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you don't have friends.
It doesn't have to be a dramatic thing. It's just like this relationship doesn't work or doesn't serve us, and we just move on. And I think that can also happen professionally in many ways, again, without having to be dramatic in any way. But usually the relationship between curators and artists is supposed to be symbiotic. Sometimes it feels like artists see us at odds, and I don't quite understand why that is, but it shouldn't be, because at the end of the day, the curator it's like, artists can do a lot of things on their own, but yeah, curators, we do depend on artists in order to be able to tell a story. But hopefully as a curator, you're trying to do right by these artists and by the things that they're trying to say. And you are serving, like I said before, as a translator between the artist and the audience. Again, you're that middle person, and that you're like, okay, so this thing, but let me explain it to you in this other way, or let me put it next to this other word so you can see it in this different light. But yeah, I think collaboration really at the end of the day should be a huge part of what a curating is. Sometimes it's harder to do than other times, but it should be a huge part, collaboration between curators and artists.
Awesome. That's it. That's the mic. I want to be respectful of your time, because you and I know, could just start a whole nother topic and then 3 hours would go by. But I loved catching up with you too. It's been too long.
It's been nice.
We got to get Ben Carter back in the mix, and then things will really get
I
crazy.
know. I just came back from New York and it was fun, but it was exhausting. I walked like 20 miles just seeing shows. So yeah, this was nice. This was nice. I really didn't want to do anything today, but this was nice. I got ready and then got to talk to you, and it was worth it. It was worth getting out of bed.
Good. Perfect. That's my new tagline. Can that be like my featured review?
Sure.
Worth getting out of bed for.
Yeah.
I like it. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts, everybody. Except everybody listening won't even have to get out of bed to do
That's
it.
right. Nice for you. Must be nice.
Angelique, where do you want people to come find you on the interwebs?
Well, they can follow me on my Instagram, which is Angelik. So angelik.wiki, as in Wikipedia. Yeah, that's how I say it usually. I also have a website. My last name is so complicated that I usually just say, just go to my Instagram first, and then you can go through the link there if you want to go to my website. But yeah, and then also I have this show that I'm working on, which opens March 18th at the Museum of Arts and Design. It's called Funk You 2, Humor and Irreverence in Ceramic Sculpture. And I'm excited for this project. There will be a catalog that I'm working on that will come out with it. And hopefully it's really cool and people like it.
Where is that museum?
I'm here. It's where I used to work when I was in an institution. It's my last project with them. But yeah,
Oh, fun.
I'm excited for it.
Awesome. Fantastic. And I will link the Instagram in the show notes, which is either in someone's podcast app that they're listening to, or just go to makersplaybook.com/podcast, and then they can just click it rather than worrying about spelling.
Cool.
Because I always mess up a spelling.
I hate having to spell out my name, to be honest.
Okay, in all seriousness, it would be amazing if you did happen to take 2 minutes to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever the heck you're listening to this podcast. I know, your hands are probably covered in clay right now, and you've probably been meaning to leave a review, but then the next podcast just automatically starts while you're working away in the studio and you forget, and... Okay, so just grab the towel right now. Wipe off your one index finger, hit pause, real quick, tap on over for the 5-star review. Okay? Cool. A big thanks to Amico for sponsoring this episode. You may have noticed that Amico isn't taking direct orders on their website currently, and while that may seem like a bad thing, the reason for it is pretty great. For the past 8 months, Amico has been focusing on supplying their distributors first. In other words, they're focusing on making sure your favorite local shop is supported before even their own website. And you can easily pick up your favorite glazes like Potter's Choice Honey Flux or Rainforest Celadon on the shelf of your local clay shop and avoid those extra shipping costs. Naturally, high demand and supply issues have made it hard to keep stores stocked these days. But Amico is dedicated to supporting your favorite small business first, now and in the future. And that, my friends, is putting your money where your values are, which you know I'm all about. If you don't yet have a favorite local shop, you can find an Amico distributor near you by visiting amico.com/dealers. Now, my friends, I know it's a crazy time of year. You might be listening to this episode while you're speed making, spending late nights in the studio to produce just a little bit more inventory of your most popular pieces in time for that big holiday show coming up. Or you're sitting at your laptop trying to sort out shipping labels after the kids go to sleep thanks to a big bump in sales on Etsy as the holidays quickly approach us all. While we all love this craft, at times it can feel lonely. If you're looking for support and helpful answers to the many questions that keep all of us up at night, or frankly, just a group of people that get it. Yes, I know your best friend is super supportive of this dream that you're pursuing, but she might not really understand the levels of anxiety created when we put a mug into a box and then into the hands of a postal service professional, holding our breath until we hear from the other person who bought that mug, desperately hoping that the handle didn't break when it was shipped. Our loved ones can be amazing sources of support, but they don't understand that level of anxiety when something's just being put in a box. So, if you're looking for other makers to connect with, share stories, and support each other along the way to figuring out how the heck to make a living from the things we make, or at least make a side hustle, I'd love for you to come check out the community. The community is our online membership and virtual home for makers. Because as I know firsthand over these last 12 years, together is the way that we really can make this dream come true. Come check it out at makersplaybook.com/community. I'm not going to lie, I have a lot of exciting things in store for the community in 2023. Once, I get all the technology figured out, of course. So more to come soon, but for now, there's a 2-week free trial, so come have a little peek around, see if it might be the virtual home that you've been looking for. Not to mention, by joining, you are helping support this very podcast. I didn't want to just do a Patreon where you're donating money and get nothing in return. With the community, you get support, the podcast gets a little bit of support. It's a win-win. Anyway, I'm rambling now because it's just such an amazing space, and I'm so excited to see our makers community growing and rallying around each other. So come check it out at makersplaybook.com/community. As always, until next time, my friends, go get back to making your dreams a reality, because together, we've got this.